Hello. This audio lecture we're going to be talking about the Middle Ages. Now the term Middle Ages was coined in the Renaissance and it covers a period of about 1,000 years. This time period is in between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which happened in the 5th century, and the Middle Ages ended with the Renaissance, which began in the year 1400. While the term Middle Ages originally meant a time of ignorance and barbarism in between these two great golden ages, that of Greece in around 300 BC, up until the Renaissance, which again started in 1400. Now we don't really think of the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance and barbarism. In fact, this was a time of great rich innovation that laid the groundwork for what became the Renaissance. In the year 323 A.D., the Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople. And that is the city that we know today as Istanbul in Turkey. What happened with this split is that the Roman Empire was split in half, and each side of the Western and the Eastern Empire had different ideas about how they structured the church. The Western Church became the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church became what we call an Eastern Orthodox, also called Byzantine. Now, in the Roman tradition, or the Western Empire, the church was independent of the state. So the leaders still held a lot of control, but they weren't actually part of the governing body. Now, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the secular and the spiritual were combined. So the emperor actually appointed the patriarch, or what you could call the pope, of the Eastern Byzantine Church. And this led to a very powerful church in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and it held on to power for centuries. Now the Catholic Church became fractionated. It splintered in the West as the church and the state struggled to maintain a balance of power. What about the rest of the world during this time? Well, as Europe broke into separate feudal states and the force of individual expression became much less important, the rest of the world was going through a great cultural evolution. In southern India, there was a culture called the Gupta people, and they developed great cities with universities and hospitals. Now, China went through 4 major dynasties, and dynasty means a period under a strong ruler. The Japanese people unified and defined themselves as a political institution, and this allowed for commercial, intellectual, scientific, and religious exchange. Now, this was a big change for Japan and really for China, because both had been relatively isolated up to this point. Along with the spread of Christianity, there was also the spread of Buddhism and the beginnings of Islam. The great explorer Marco Polo set off around the year 1200 to journey from Baghdad to the China Sea. He came home and wrote a book called Description of the World, and this book sparked a wide interest in the world beyond the boundaries of feudal Europe. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Christian Crusades spread European influence all across the Middle East. And it was Islamic scholars that preserved ancient Greek and Roman literature and philosophy. To the right is an image of a monk from Japan, and I don't know how well you can see it, but I find it really a delightful work of art. Because according to this tradition, the monk would say the name of the Buddha constantly as a form of prayer. There's a term called mantra, and that's what that means. Now in this sculpture, the Buddha is actually coming out of the monk's mouth. So if you look closely, you see all these little Buddhas, like he's saying this name, and they're actually literally coming out of his mouth. I just think that's a really delightful interpretation. Now below we have a painting, a brush painting, which is from a Chinese scroll. The thing about brush painting is that the best artists work very quickly. They just lay down that stroke and they don't go back to it. So that's one of the things that we see in this style of painting. Now let's talk for a moment about early Christianity. In the early days of the Christian church, before Constantine ended persecution of the Christians, people had to meet in private homes to worship. They also met in the catacombs, which were burial chambers under populated areas. Around the year 40 AD, the term Christian was first used, and around 70 or 80 years after the turn of the millennium, this is when Christianity broke from Judaism and the New Testament was written. By the early 2nd century, the hierarchical and internal structure of the church and the liturgy were being developed. And the term liturgy just means the ritual of worship. How do people go about it? To the left is a model of an early Christian baptismal font, and this would have been in a private home. And below that is a home synagogue that the Jewish faith would have used. Below right, just below this text, is the catacombs where early Christians worshipped. Let's look for a moment at early Christian art. Now, the earliest Christian worshipers were mostly poor people and women who were later joined by upper-class converts. Because these early Christians had to meet in secret, very little of their art has survived. To the left is a statue that strongly reflects Greek influences, and it also shows this well-known symbolism of a shepherd caring for his flock. In fact, this piece to the left is very detailed and very anatomically correct for the time period. Now below are two images of Jonah and the whale. Check out this whale. Apparently the artist hadn't really ever seen one, because if you look closely, it's like a hippopotamus pig whale. He's got little feet. See, look at the one on the right, you can really see it. And I mean, it's pretty good imagination, but not quite it. Now an important thing happened in Christian faith around the year 325 AD. And this is when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine from Rome, he convened the first Nicene Council. And what this council did was it completed a Latin form of the Bible. This was called the Vulgate, which means for the common people. So in other words, they created the actual Bible as we know it today in the year 325 AD. And Constantine also made Christianity legal, so Christians were no longer persecuted. As a result, it became necessary to build a whole lot of churches in a hurry. Now, during the Middle Ages, artists did not sign their work in general, and individual artistic expression was actually discouraged. One outlet for creativity was the handwritten manuscripts made by monks. Here are two examples from around the year 600. These surviving manuscripts are important historic and artistic relics. Notice the detail on these. They're really exquisite. And I can easily imagine these monks bent over the vellum or the calf skin, working laboriously for hours and hours to make these delicate patterns. They're very uniform also. Here's another example of a big P, and one more that's a little bit different from a prayer book of the time. So now let's talk about churches. After the Edict of Milan in 313, when Constantine ended the persecution of Christians, there was an urgent need to build churches. And out of this need, two main styles of churches developed. The first was called the Basilica plan, and it's pictured above left. This is what we know is most familiar for the churches that we worship in today. The second, called the Central plan, is lower left, and it's also below on the right. Although the Basilica plan was modeled on the old Roman forums, the first model for the church was Old St. Peter's in the city of Rome. It was built in 333 on the spot where St. Peter was supposed to have been crucified. Now this design, as I said, was widely adapted by the Western Church. Now the Eastern Church favored the Central plan. If you look closely at the Central plan, it's interesting because the altar is actually in the center and the worshipers sit all the way around, whereas the Basilica plan definitely has a front and a large area for people to sit in. Let's talk about mosaics. First off, what the heck is a mosaic? You need to know this. A mosaic refers to a picture made from small pieces of colored marble or glass assembled on floor or wall surfaces. Although this method was widely used in Roman times, in the Middle Ages it became a way to create pictures designed to convey a sacred meaning. So the Romans started using mosaic. They used it for decorative purposes. But when we get to the Middle Ages, the artist used it as a way of storytelling about the Bible to people that were illiterate. These pictures often incorporated gold elements, which caused them to shimmer, really got people's attention. Notice how the characters in these images are becoming very flattened and simplified compared to the Greek images, and the heads are kind of all at the same height with a direct outward gaze. So art is not necessarily getting worse, it's just getting simpler. Now let's talk about a beautiful church, Hagia Sophia. It looks like Hagia Sophia, but you say Hagia Sophia. While the Western Roman Empire was weakening, the Eastern Byzantine Empire was getting stronger. The Church of the Holy Wisdom, or Hagia Sophia, was first built in the year 532. In 586, the dome collapsed in an earthquake, and so it was rebuilt 20 feet higher, and this is still standing today. In the early 1400s, this church was turned into a mosque, and that's when the minarets, or the tall spires that you see in the picture below, were added. Now, after being first a Christian church and then a mosque, this beautiful structure is a secular museum. Although this is very similar to the Pantheon in Rome, it also has elements of both of the church designs that we just looked at. Look at the row of windows in the picture on the left, up under the dome. They say that when you're in Hagia Sophia, it looks like this dome is floating on a golden chain when the light is coming in through the windows. You know, it is on the short list, I tell you, of architectural structures that I would love to see in my life. One more thing I'd like you to notice is the people. Way at the bottom. You see how teeny they are? That's how big this space is. Now let's talk about icons. We're going to talk about icons in this week's discussion also. Icon is another term that you will need to define. And an icon basically means, the textbook definition says that it refers to a sacred image or event. But icons are basically images that are symbolic of something much greater really than their actual value. Above us here in this picture is a mosaic from Hagia Sophia, and it's an image of Christ. The term icon, here we go, means an image representing a sacred figure or event. And many early Christians believed that a consecrated work of art was a kind of a vehicle to communicate with the spiritual world. So prayer rituals involved worship actually of the images, and pilgrims would go on long journeys to visit sacred shrines. So what I'm saying here is that the early Christians began to really worship the artwork as much as they were worshiping the stories and the tradition behind the artwork, and that was a problem for some people. Many church leaders viewed this practice as being dangerously close to idol worship. So beginning in the year 726, the Emperor Leo III undertook a campaign called Iconoclasm, or image breaking, in which all religious images were destroyed. Those who defended the images were persecuted. Over the next 120 years, iconoclasts were in power, and they ruled the church sporadically. But then that all changed. Let's see. Here's another example of an icon. The iconoclasts weakened church power as the wealth of art drew patrons and converts. So in other words, people come to see the art and worship the art. They bring a lot of money and they pay their alms. This helps the church to be more prosperous. Now, when the iconoclasts kind of destroyed all that work, which they did, they destroyed a whole lot of artwork because they felt it had become an idol to the people. And so there was a tension between the East and the West. Eventually, they made a distinction. There's veneration and respect, which is a way of honoring images without worshiping them, and also the images were used as a teaching tool for the largely illiterate worshipers. So with this slide, we'll end phase 1 of the audio lecture on the Middle Ages. Now be sure and watch the second half to get the full story. And as always, thanks for listening.